The Brothers Grimm. The Grimm brothers, or Brothers Grimm, refers to two brothers named Jacob Grimm and Wilhelm Grimm. Jacob Grimm, the elder brother, was born in 1785. The younger brother, Wilhelm Grimm, was born 1 year later in 1786. The brothers grew up and lived in the area that we now know as Germany, although at the time the country of Germany did not yet exist, and the land of the German-speaking people was made up of several smaller Germanic kingdoms. Jacob and Wilhelm came from a large family. Besides themselves, they had 7 other brothers and sisters. Unfortunately, their father got sick and died when Wilhelm and Jacob were only 10 and 11 years old. This was the beginning of hard times for the Grimm family. At that time, there were no government programs to help the poor. Without their father, the boys had to find a way to get money for their family by themselves. The 2 boys studied very hard and eventually got into a very good school. The other children in the school were from rich families, and they had had a better education than the Grimm brothers. But the Grimm brothers worked extra hard to catch up to the other students. Their teachers began to respect their efforts. After graduation, the boys went to university. Jacob, the older brother, went first, and Wilhelm joined him the following year. Their mother wanted them to study law so that they could get a good job. But the brothers were also interested in history, literature, and folklore. Folklore means old traditional stories. At university, the boys had a favorite teacher, a young professor named Friedrich Karl von Savigny. He got the brothers interested in German history and culture. He also let the brothers use his library. Back in those days, there were no public libraries, and books were very expensive. So, most ordinary people weren't able to read a lot of books. Being able to use the library opened up a whole new world to the brothers. The brothers were interested in great literature, but they also became interested in old folk stories. These were the stories that were told in the countryside and in the villages. Often, these stories were told by uneducated people who couldn't read or write. The stories were never written down, but they were told and retold so often in the villages that they had been remembered for many generations. People learned these stories from their friends and neighbors, and children learned these stories from their parents. Before the Grimm brothers, very few educated people were interested in these stories. They considered these stories to be unimportant because they weren't great literature. But the Grimm brothers thought that these stories were important because they represented the culture of Germany. In some ways, they thought these stories were more important than great literature because these were the stories that most of the people knew and enjoyed. However, since no one was writing these stories down, the Grimm brothers became worried that these stories might one day become forgotten. They wanted to write down these stories so that they could save them for future generations. So, they started a project to collect all the stories and folk tales that they could. They went to the libraries, they asked their friends, and they traveled around Germany and Europe. They invited famous storytellers to come to their home and wrote down all of their stories. They even went to the prisons and talked to the thieves and robbers in the prisons. They wanted to write down all the robbers' stories exactly as the robbers told them. In 1812, they published a collection of stories. In English, these stories were called Grimm's Fairy Tales. Fairy tale is the English name for old traditional stories. No one knows exactly where the name fairy tale comes from. Tale is another word for story in English. Fairy is a magical creature. So maybe the name comes from a magical story. Many, but not all, of the Grimm's fairy tales have magic in the story. When the Grimm brothers first published their stories in 1812, many people complained. They said that the stories were violent and cruel and not suitable for children. It is true that many of the stories were violent and cruel, but it is also important to remember that many of the stories were never intended for children. In the days before television, storytelling was used not only to entertain children, but also adults. Many of the stories were told by adults for adults. Throughout their lives, the Grimm brothers would work on their fairy tale collection. They added new stories, and they also changed some of the old stories to make them less violent and more suitable for children. Finally, in 1857, they published the final 7th edition with 211 stories. The Grimm's fairy tales were mostly from Germany and France, although some of the stories were told are very old and were popular in many European countries. Many of the Grimm's fairy tales are very famous nowadays, such as Cinderella, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, Hansel and Gretel, Little Red Riding Hood, Rapunzel, Sleeping Beauty, and many more. But if the Grimm brothers had not written these stories down, they might have been lost to history. Today, the Grimm's fairy tales is the most famous collection of folk tales and fairy tales in the Western world.